Jai Hind and welcome to Dev Talks. This is Aadi. As a lot of you may recognize, I have with me Ms. Shalini Chawla, Distinguished Fellow for the Center of Air Power and Studies, an expert in Pakistan and, of course, Afghanistan. She writes herself that she's trying to understand, but I kind of don't believe that because I've heard her speak about the region, some very, very wise stuff. And that's why I thought we could get her down to Dev Talks so that we can talk about the brewing situation within that region, Afghanistan and Pakistan. Thank you, ma'am, joining me. And it's an
Thank
interesting subject always.
you for having me.
Ma'am, let me start you up with a philosophical sort of a question. You know, the world was, when the Taliban issue was happening in the month of August last year, the world knew that this is going to be trouble for Pakistan. Except the Pakistanis, I think everybody knew that this is bad for them. Did they make a strategic error? Did they misread the situation? What happened?
Yeah, you are right that there were very strong opinions, talking about the fact that this will not be good for Pakistan, and not only internationally, but also, there have been opinions and strong arguments within Pakistan about the repercussions of the Taliban takeover of Kabul. But unfortunately, the voices that raise concerns about the actual well-being of Pakistan are never reflected in its policy making. One of the factors to which growth of extremism and radicalization in Pakistan has been linked is the sustained presence of the Taliban, and then eventually increasing control of the Taliban in Afghanistan. Now, why did Pakistan do it despite the fact that there were very strong opinions, debating and the fact that what will be the impact on Pakistan? So now Pakistan's strategy, has been to support the Taliban through decades of war on terror. We saw they did not allow the democratically elected regime, which actually represented the Afghans, to stabilize, and finally facilitated the Taliban takeover of Kabul. Now, why the leadership in Pakistan wanted Taliban in power? This is basically to fulfill their strategic objectives, which have remained unchanged. So, no matter how many times Pakistan says that they want stability in Afghanistan, till the time their strategic objectives in Afghanistan change, their strategy is not going to change, and Afghanistan obviously cannot stabilize. And talking about their strategic objectives, so I would say mainly there are four major objectives that I can think about. One and the most critical, first and the most critical one is the lingering Afghanistan-Pakistan border issue, based on the disagreement over the Durand line. This is a critical factor shaping Pakistan's strategy towards Afghanistan. And no Afghan regime, including the Rabbani government in the mid 1990s, has ever accepted the legitimacy of the border, which was basically drawn by the British in 1893. So that remains a very important issue. Secondly, Pakistan has faced the issue of Pashtun nationalism, which demanded a separate Pashtunistan since 1940s within its own territory. So, control and influence over Afghanistan by a Pashtun-dominated, group, basically Taliban, would, in their own mind, reduce the demand for a separate Pashtunistan, and yet have Pakistani Pashtun under the establishment control. That has been the feeling that will help them to control this whole resentment within Pakistani territory. A third is that Pakistan has used the Afghan territory as a safe haven to train the, anti-India terror groups like Lashkar-e-Taiba, Jaish-e Mohammed, etc., starting from the late 1990s, and they intend use use this territory now. So that's why controlling the Afghanistan through their proxy, setup makes sense in their own mind. And fourthly, and very importantly, Pakistan always felt that having a pro-Pakistan government in Afghanistan, a regime in Afghanistan, would undermine Indian influence and engagement in Afghanistan. So that is another factor which is very important for them. And these are the four factors which have remained unchanged for Pakistan's strategy in Afghanistan. And that is why we would see that despite resentment, despite very strong opinions which kind of talked about repercussions on Pakistan of the Taliban takeover in Kabul, Pakistan was pretty determined to go ahead and facilitate the Taliban's takeover there.
Something really interesting that I find from your answer, ma'am, out of the four things that you've actually mentioned, two of them are India centric. And that,
That's
of
right.
course, is quite telling for a country's thought process that they want to be anti someone rather than pro themselves. So that's a bit telling. In spite of what you've mentioned, ma'am, the main question that I still want to ask is because they were building this fence between both the countries prior to a lot of these issues actually came to bear, and they tried completing it after the Taliban came in. Now, if this was the style of control that the Pakistanis thought, if I may use that word, had on the Taliban, why build this fence?
So in March, sometime in 2017, 2017, Pakistan started fencing the Durand line. Um, After there were repeated cross-border attacks from the Pakistani posts. And last year, in 2021, they claimed that they have completed fencing of close to 90% of the border. And the fencing of the Durand line, Adi, was strongly opposed by the Ghani government, people from both sides who had families. Now their families were divided between the two countries. But there was tremendous resentment on this fence. And despite that, Pakistan when establishment went in for the fence, and because of mainly again, I would to my mind there were four important factors for them to go in for the fence. First was what I mentioned again is about because of the contested nature of the Afghanistan-Pakistan border, which has always been a very deep concern for the Pakistani leadership. So the ruling elites have always been apprehensive about the Afghans claiming the rights of the Pashtun areas of Pakistan. So this has been a factor playing on their mind, and in their own mind, by putting a fence, Pakistan would physically demarcate the border and, in a way, put an end to the contentious nature of the border. Now, that was a different issue that even Taliban are not ready to recognize this border, and they have been very opposed to the fence. Second is that Pakistan has been concerned about the Pashtun sentiments on its borders, which I spoke. And fencing, again, they feel that it would reduce a free flowing movement between the two sides. So, reduce the interaction and restrict, or rather, I would say, control that interaction. Thirdly, there have been series of terror attacks on the civilians, and but mainly security establishments from the Taliban Pakistan, the TTP group, which has the Pakistan military says that, and there are reports that they have safe havens in Afghanistan. Now, by having this so-called multi-layered fence and imposing strict checks, Pakistan wants to guard the cross-border infiltration of the terror groups into its own territory, and this was one of the factors which Faiz Hamid cited repeatedly. That that's why they were building the fence, the terrorism to control terrorism. And fourthly, and I think this is also very important, that Pakistan did anticipate the rise of instability in Afghanistan. After this whole exit momentum was being expedited, and it did expect that there's going to be an expedited surge in Afghan refugees in Pakistan, and so fencing they felt was an effective means to control the Afghan migration into Pakistan. So, in their own mind, that's why fencing of the border was essential, despite the fact that it was being opposed by the Ghani government at that time. And then we have seen what happened with the Taliban. There were incidents of Taliban taking out the fence and throwing and breaking. So this was major point of has been a major point of friction between the Afghan Taliban and Pakistani establishment.
That's interesting, ma'am. But also, you mentioned the TTP, and that's where my next question comes from. Recently, we heard news of Pakistan carrying out airstrikes, and there are contested numbers with regards to the amount of people that have died on that airstrike. Somebody says 41, somebody says 8, and so on and so forth. Keeping that one incident aside, and I don't want to dwell upon that incident too much, but just the general factor of the support that the TTP has from the Afghan Taliban is well known. And as you mentioned in your first answer as well, it's well known within Pakistan as well. What is the thought process here, ma'am? Because they've tried controlling them. They're not. 100 of the Pakistani soldiers have died in the past 3-4 months. What's the thought process here? How do you analyze the whole TTP situation? Are they getting more stronger?
So TTPC came into being in say 2007 and 8, and we saw that it took really gathered momentum for a few years. A lot of suicide bombings, number of attacks were going on, and then we saw that how Pakistan military conducted its counter-terror operations, Zarbiya's bin Radul Fasad, where TTP did take a hit. But then in 2020, the group, I'm talking about the TTP, announced the merger again of its two major splinter groups, Jamaatul Arhar and Hizbul Arhar. Now, this development is important as the militant group, has been on a run for some time, and it found sanctuaries in Afghanistan. Now, this group has obviously gained strength, and a series of attacks have been conducted over the past 2 years, specifically targeting the security personnel in Pakistan. So the return of TTP fighters in North Waziristan has obviously very complicated the security dynamics in Pakistan. And Pakistan government did extend the offer of talks with the group, if you would remember, and proposed that the state is ready to grant amnesty to the TTP fighters if the group agreed to give a violence. But obviously the talks didn't have any productive results, and because TTP's demands were very different, and they are trying to follow the footsteps of Afghan Taliban. Now, TTP has been emboldened to your question, and that's very, very natural. Now, what I would say is that the Afghan Taliban and the Pakistani Taliban, which is the TTP, are the two sides of the same coin. Although the Afghan Taliban has not officially and openly talked about supporting the TTP, but the fact is that they are ideological brothers. And when Taliban in Afghanistan came into power, you would remember that the first thing that they did was to release the TTP prisoners. And now, when the Afghan Taliban are in power, the feeling within the TTP is that if they can do it, it's a victory of an ideology. So why can't they do it? And they were the first one to congratulate the Afghan Taliban. And what is what you see here is a contradiction in Pakistan's positioning. Now, here at one side in Afghanistan, they are sanctioning the same group, group with the same ideology, to run the country, seek legitimacy for the country at the international level. And on the other side, the same group sharing that ideology within Pakistan is being called the terrorists. So there are. Pakistani establishment had a very strong feeling that Afghan Taliban would be able to control the TTP, but that hasn't happened. And there are obviously reports, as we spoke, that TTP groups are based in Afghanistan. And in fact, whatever Pakistan has been, if you see what now is happening exactly, that they are asking the Afghan Taliban to control TTP, and the opposition that the Afghan Taliban is taking, that we don't know. It's actually exactly something what Pakistan has been doing with the United States and in the rest of the world. Throughout the war on terror, they kept on supporting the Haqqani Network and the Taliban, and kept on saying that, we don't know what's happening there. And the same thing, same position, it's like a full circle for Taliban. So for Pakistan. So Taliban, I think, have learned the tactics and positioning from the Pakistan military only because they worked with them for so long. So they continue to shelter TTP, but they will continue to deny that what they are doing. So I feel TTP posturing to me looks like will remain unchanged. I don't see a reason for them to change their position, as their demands obviously cannot be met. They want Sharia in Pakistan, and they want to have their office in the third party like the Afghan Taliban did. So the tensions between Taliban in Afghanistan and Pakistan will increase on this front, because I don't see TTP lowering their guards. The strikes will also go on, as Pakistan military, we have seen in the past, is most comfortable with the military response to the situation of this nature. So we will see an increasing military response from the Pakistan military, until and unless the Afghan Taliban give the Pakistani establishment an assurance that they will manage their ideological brother, I mean the TTP. So until unless that happens, I don't see TTP changing their pattern in any form. And this is likely to gain momentum, intensify. The whole issue might become more complicated for Pakistan.
That's a far cry, man. In the sense, the cutting off
Yes,
support of two brothers is, and those guys work on a matter of honor and principle and the code. And
exactly.
ma'am, let's talk about radicalization. A lot of Pakistani analysts fear for the fact that you're going the Afghanistan way, and I'm talking about some very prominent guys who talk about the fact that तुम्हारा रास्ता तो अब उस तरफ है. You're walking on that particular path of becoming the second Taliban controlled or Taliban like country in the world. Uh, there are incidents like Sialkot and multiple other, I mean, of course, horrible, horrible incidents. How do you look at the radicalization existing within the country and being, the fire, the oil being added by people like Imran Khan, who's taking it a step further in terms of his jalsas and this and that and all that other stuff? How do you see that entire situation? It's like a powder keg to my mind, man.
So you're very right, in Adi, in terms of describing the thought process and the apprehensions which are there. कि भाई आपका क्या रास्ता है, कहाँ चल रहे हैं आप? But if you kind of see the whole history of Pakistan, even in the last, say, 30, 40 years, you say, so extremism or say radicalization is not a phenomena which has developed overnight in Pakistan. We are seeing it in the form when it's much more intensified, but it has been brewing for quite some time. It has been building up for decades now, and the fact is that the current phase of radicalization that we see today, it is a result of Pakistan's policy it adopted at the domestic level, its strategic choices at the international level. So at the domestic level, in the past, we have seen Pakistan military encourage the radical groups during Zia's time. It all started to balance the political forces. And at the foreign policy level, we have seen that how religion has been extensively used in its policy towards India. So if you have to see the use of religion in Pakistan, so from nation building to running of the country to, and then finally securing the territorial boundaries, religion and radical interpretation of religion has been an important part of Pakistani strategy. And no sincere effort to control it or reverse it, to my mind, in the last 10 years, nothing. I mean, I have not seen anything very sincerely happening to reverse it. And if we see in the last decade, to my mind, I think the most glaring incident was in 2011, which was the beginning of multiple incidents, was the assassination of Salman Taseer, governor of Punjab, by one of his own bodyguards, Mumtaz Qadri, who has incidentally a major fan following in Pakistan. And the
Was
way
celebrated.
Qadri was welcomed, seen as a hero, and not only was he seen as a hailed as a hero and guardian of Islam, but around, if you remember, 500 Pakistani scholars and clerics that time warned the masses against participation in Tasi's funerals. It was to that extent. And then we saw a series of incidents indicating increase in radicalization in the society, and also lack of tolerance for the liberal thinking. We saw how the liberal thinking was attacked, how the press was attacked, media was attacked. So Pakistan is facing challenges of increasing radicalization, and the emerging trends are definitely worrisome. But the important point here is that I'm not sure whether the state essentially feels threatened with the rising extremism, or it seeks to draw support from the extremist narratives and trends. So, it is working both way for them. So, as I said, Pakistan's reliance on religion started mainly to assert on its identity, which is different from India. That was the beginning of it. And eventually, the widening gap between the two countries, Pakistan's inability to match India's growth trajectory, that led to intensified use of religion and a narrative of threat perception vis a vis India. And this, I feel, is unlikely to change soon. So I feel this trend is not reversible in my view. So this is definitely challenging and worrisome for Pakistan. Yeah,
And for the region as well, ma'am. Talking
for
about
the
that,
region.
talking about that, there is an entity within this region that does not believe any borders. That's the ISIS. They talk about basically a Sara Hamara hai, and that's it. There's no lines and all that stuff that they are concerned with. There was recently a bomb blast that took place in Afghanistan. ISIS claimed responsibility. The Afghans went, picked up somebody, and did whatever they needed to do. Now, we know there's a teetering balance that exists between ISIS, Al Qaeda, Taliban, and all these guys with regards the hierarchy or the levels of extremism within their organizations. But what happens when these organizations start clashing? And do you think this is like the first step of that particular clash?
So ISIS has presence in Afghanistan. From 2014, we have been hearing about, they're trying to expand themselves. But recently, as you said, they have the ISIS number of attacks have gone up significantly. But any instability of the nature that we have now in Afghanistan will provide a very fertile ground to the terror groups, that we all would agree. Now, ISIS has been gaining ground mainly because of the fractions among the Taliban. So those issues are already there. I don't see ISIS flourishing too much because Taliban will still be very strong and will be there to counter them. There's an interesting thought process with ISIS also, and I'll come to your question later, but just something which I want to share is the presence of Islamic State in Afghanistan also raises importance of Taliban, because if you see the regional actors like China, Russia, all of them wanted to engage with the Taliban. They were so keen before the US exit. And one of the factors was that the regional actors was concerned about the ISIS expansion in their territory, and they wanted to seek Taliban support to control ISIS. So that's been one factor which has been drawing all these actors and their engagement with Taliban. So that it's a significant fear that the region has. Now, coming back to your question, the Islamic State is able to now, they would want to continue to escalate their aim, and they are able to continue their attacks because of divisions amongst the Taliban. There's also frustration amongst the Taliban that it's been now, say, 8.5 months, and nothing has happened till now after that whole major victory of Taliban, that what has happened, this ideology has won. Nothing substantial has happened for the state. There's major economic crisis. The dependency on the external world is high. There's no recognition even from their so-called best friends, China and Russia. So these are the factors which are allowing Islamic State to expand. So I think ISIS will escalate the attacks, but you will see just a very intense fighting between these two groups. And I think ISIS would also, this is also providing its more opportunity to expand itself in the region. So yeah, to your question, I agree with that factor that ISIS, in the coming times, we will see ISIS expansion in the region, given what's happening in Afghanistan and the group's expanded activities now.
What you describe is basically the similar sectarian kind of violence which started off in the regions where ISIS used to operate in the Middle East, Iraq, Syria, and all that. They attacked the opposition in terms of the Shias and the Sunni, the Shia mosques, and created a whole.
So that's what is happening. They are attacking the Hazara community here also. The only difference here is that, Taliban still obviously has, despite the fact that you would say that there are problems between Pakistan and Taliban, and there are, tensions, but still the Taliban has backing of Pakistan military. So to what extent ISIS can go ahead in Afghanistan, that is something we need to think, given the fact that Taliban has the support system from Pakistan. So that might help Taliban to counter the ISIS expansion there, in case they manage that support system from Pakistan. So they have the significant dependence even now, although on the ground we are seeing multiple disagreements on the fence, and now TTP's presence there. But overall, right now itself, we have seen Pakistan still have that support system from Pakistan would be there for Taliban. So, it's a complex situation.
Yeah.
But let's see. I mean, if you are trying to ask that can they convert Pakistan into another, say, Syria, or Afghanistan into another Syria, if they can totally take control there, that I doubt they'll be able to do so, because that will even hurt Pakistan's strategic interests. And when it comes to their strategic interest, then I think Pakistan will extend its support to Taliban
At least militarily. If
militarily. Yeah, militarily, that's what I
I'm
meant.
coming to the end of this very interesting interview, where you've actually taken us around the entire region, where we've discussed quite a bit of factors which can destabilize this entire place, and including India for that matter. I'd like to talk about one very chupa chupa organization which is now rearing its head up, called the TLP. It is known as the establishment's gun, and they take it out when they need to, for whatever reasons that they have. But in the last time that the TLP reared its head, we also realized that TLP had a mass following. It was not just, here and there. And they are being brought into the center stream of politics and this and that and everything. We are also aware of extremist elements within that TLP who are wanting to do certain things. The Sialkot incident. Now here is a centrist organization which is being built up by the state, which is teetering on extremism. How do you think this balances itself out within Pakistan, and ramifications for the country, man?
Yeah, you're right, and I think it's a very very interesting question, and our discussion would have been incomplete without that. So yes, traditionally, military establishment has been using the religious parties for its own agenda. But what was distinct in 2018 elections, what we saw was that these elections 2018 provided political space to the candidates representing jihadi and extremist groups, despite ample controversies and apprehensions that were raised over future implications of the development. So we saw that happening in 2018. And what happened in that election with the TLP, Tehreek-e-Labbaik Pakistan? It's a newly formed party and has an aggressive face of Barelvi politics that emerged as the fifth largest party in the National Assembly. So TLP started as a protest movement, and it was registered as a political party by one of its founders, Khadim Hussain Rizvi, in 2017. Now, this group rose from the protests after Mumtaz Qadri's execution, which and came to the lifeline in 2017. It blocked Islamabad for several weeks, demanding a stricter enforcement of blasphemy laws. So that's been the position that it's been taking. Now, what does it imply? This whole phenomena, of these parties coming into limelight and then holding their head up, now and then. I think this indicates the revival of Barelvi sectarian politics in Pakistan. And it's likely to have long term implications for the state. Although lately the leadership has tried to control the TLP's this aggressive posturing, and they are using punitive means, it looks like Barelvi organizations will continue to try to increase pressure on the government through mass protests or other means, whatever they can do. So there will be an effort to employ sectarian discourse by these groups, which will be a challenge for the state. And I feel, in a nutshell, that these trends will invariably retard Pakistan's overall growth and its development.
I, I mean, very, very less spoken about, and you brought out the Barelvi angle that a lot of people don't want to discuss or don't bring it up for whatever reasons are there. It's a very, very less spoken about argument, mostly because this is just my analysis, correct me if I'm wrong, it is this organization has been propped up by the establishment. So a lot of people don't like to talk about any other angle, and you brought this out, which is very interesting, ma'am.
Within Pakistan, yes, a lot of people don't. But if you see what will this whole trend imply, this is what it's going to imply to your question. What will it mean for the Pakistani state? So revival of that whole discourse, strengthening of that discourse, And for any state, this discourse will definitely retard the whole process, the growth process.
Absolutely, absolutely. And Pakistan, I don't think, is in a place where this can be afforded at this particular stage in their history and course of life. Ma'am, thank you so much. This has been an eye opener of an interview. We started off talking about the whole Taliban issue and where Pakistan felt that they had an advantage within the Taliban coming in, and they did whatever they need to do. Today, we see a blowback from the other side where the defense minister is actually warning Pakistan. So that's, it's a ramification of probably a bad mistake, as you also brought out, for whatever four reasons that you mentioned. It is an interesting region where I think a lot of things, as you also describe, are going to be on the teetering edge of either being resolved or resulting in complete chaos. And of course, the ISIS, the world knows what it did in the Middle East, but of course, they won't have the same force, but they do have a huge amount of cult following, and that makes it very difficult for it to be controlled. At the end, ma'am, thank you so much, and I'd like to, invite you for once again sometime in the future for another subject on this very interesting region, which has ramifications for our own very country. Once again, sometime. Till then, ma'am, Jai Hind.
Thank you very much. Thank you.